When people try to find fault with the Bible, they often bring up the subject of slavery. And yes, slavery is found throughout the Bible, from its first book, Genesis, to near the end of the New Testament. But the reason for that is that slavery existed in Bible lands and all over the rest of the world throughout all of human history. The Bible did not institute slavery. Slavery was already being practiced by every race and every nation for thousands of years before Moses wrote the first books of the Bible. So the Bible makes note of it whenever it impacted the people whose lives are discussed in the scriptures. Most of the people of the world had long been in rebellion against the true God, doing whatever they wanted, and often using false religion to justify their actions. But in cases where people turned to the true God to follow his instructions, God gave them instructions limiting and restricting the practice of slavery. Eventually, Christians took a leading role in abolition movements to put an end to slavery, and its complete elimination is one of the blessings that will come eventually in answer to the prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." God's will is not for people to enslave other people. But in the meantime, what can we say to those who try to find fault with the Bible by pulling biblical references to slavery out of context? First of all, we need to remember that the context of any particular passage of Scripture is not just the surrounding verses and chapters, but also the context includes the surrounding world at the time when the passage was written. While many Bible passages are addressed to all of us, some other passages are written primarily to individuals living at that time under the circumstances they found themselves in. We can learn from those passages too, but we need to keep the context in mind in order to draw the correct conclusions. For example, we may find it shocking to read that when Abraham and Sarah were unable to produce offspring, Sarah gave her slave girl Hagar to her husband to produce offspring through her. We read, Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. That's shocking to us today, but it was completely legal back then and was actually a common practice. Notice, though, that it was not God who suggested doing this. It was Sarah's idea. And it wasn't the way God wanted Abraham to produce an heir to the promises God had given him. So God miraculously, after that, enabled Abraham and Sarah to have a son of their own, Isaac, despite Sarah being about 90 years old. When it became necessary for Abraham later on to send off on their own Hagar and her then teenage son Ishmael, God provided for them miraculously and promised that nations would descend from Ishmael. And today, many of the Arabs in the Middle East boast of their descent from Ishmael and his mother Hagar, who had been Abraham and Sarah's slave. We today find it similarly shocking to read in Genesis that Abraham's great-grandsons, through Isaac, sold their brother Joseph into slavery. We read in Genesis chapter 37, "So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver, and the traders took him to Egypt." Selling their youngest brother into slavery like that was heartless and cruel. It put Joseph in peril of his life, and it left their father in perpetual mourning for his youngest son when his brothers covered up what they did by telling their father that Joseph had been killed. But if we assume that such an act was also illegal, a crime that could be severely punished, we're wrong. Selling their brother into slavery at that time and place did not put them under any criminal penalty. In fact, it was quite common all down through human history to sell family members as slaves. Slavery was legal and was actually an integral part of community life all over the world. People could become slaves in many different ways. Some parents sold one or more of their children to help the rest of the family financially. Many people sold themselves into slavery to avoid death by starvation when they had no other way to provide for themselves. In lands that had functioning judicial systems, the courts often sentenced into slavery people convicted of crimes. England, for example, did that right up until the late 1800s. Another major source of slavery and slaves was armed conflict. When one nation defeated another in war, many of the people on the losing side were often taken captive and sold as slaves in the victorious nation. We see an example of that when the Roman Empire recaptured Jerusalem after the Jewish people had staged a revolt. It occurred just as Jesus had foretold. Jesus said, "There will be great distress upon the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden down." The Jews who were carried off captive from Jerusalem were sold in the Roman slave market. Slaves who were put up for sale were displayed in public, often on a raised platform, either naked or half naked, with a wooden sign hung around their neck, a sign displaying their name, their age, their skills, and other selling points. People of all races and nationalities were put up for sale to the highest bidder. And historical artifacts dug up by archaeologists show that slave markets like that operated all over the world throughout history, such as this one in ancient Egypt. And this is a painting of the slave market in Constantinople, now Istanbul, Turkey. The Bible refers to people in places from Europe to Ethiopia and from Spain to India, but slavery was common all over the world, including Oriental lands of the Far East. Ireland's most famous slave was St. Patrick. Patrick was just a boy in his native England when pagan Irish raiders captured him and took him back to Ireland as a slave. He eventually escaped and made his way back to England, but he returned later to Ireland to bring the gospel of Christ to pagan Irishmen. African tribes enslaved members of other African tribes and used them for forced labor or sold them to foreigners. As late as the 1800s, North African Barbary pirates raided European coastal communities and took Europeans captive off ships at sea also and sold them as slaves in North Africa. Even though it was common and practiced everywhere, the Bible condemned slave trading as a serious sin. Paul's letter to Timothy lists slave traders right along with murderers and the sexually immoral as people who are ungodly and sinful. He writes, "For the law was not intended for people who do what is right. It is for people who are lawless and rebellious, who are ungodly and sinful, who consider nothing sacred and defile what is holy, who kill their father or mother or commit other murders. The law is for people who are sexually immoral or who practice homosexuality or are slave traders, liars, promise breakers, or who do anything else that contradicts the wholesome teaching that comes from the glorious good news." So although slave trading was carried on everywhere in the world at that time, the Bible condemned it, right along with other serious sins. Abolitionist movements to abolish slavery were led by Bible-believing Christians in the United States and England. Quakers and Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon and Methodist founder John Wesley denounced slavery as a sin that should be outlawed. In the mid-1700s, a man named John Newton worked as a young man buying slaves in Africa, and then he became a captain of slave ships that were used to transport slaves in the slave trade. Later in life, John Newton became a Christian minister, and he wrote the popular hymn, Amazing Grace. He spent the last 22 years of his life campaigning against slavery, and Newton helped convince the British Parliament to abolish the slave trade in 1807. And in 1833, slavery itself was outlawed throughout the British Empire, which stretched around the world at that time. Slavery continued in the United States until the 1860s, and it persisted in other parts of the world, particularly in non-Christian nations, for some time after that. For example, as late as 1895, the famous slave trader Hamad ibn Muhammad in Zanzibar still owned at that time 10,000 slaves. Female slaves were still being sold in the Empire of the Ottoman Turks as recently as 1908 or 1915, and Turkish law didn't officially ban slavery until 1964. Even in the modern world, with slavery officially outlawed, human trafficking continues to be a problem, and government-sponsored slavery has continued to appear in places like Nazi concentration camps and the re-education camps in China and North Korea. So the organized groups today that try to portray America as an evil nation due to the slavery that existed here 200 years ago are doing that for political reasons. And they get away with it only because so many are ignorant of the historical facts. The fact that people of all races and nationalities have been abused as slaves at one time or another throughout human history. The Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament focus primarily on the Middle East, and that's where we find the Hebrew people in slavery in the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 1 tells us the Egyptians appointed taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. Every service they imposed was harsh. The descendants of Abraham's grandson Israel were in slavery in Egypt for 200 years or more, until God sent Moses to Pharaoh with the message, "Let my people go." After the Israelites were set free from Egypt, God led them into the promised land, the land he had promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And having just been freed from slavery themselves, the Israelites left Egypt and entered that promised land without any slaves of their own. But since all the nations of the world practiced slavery at that time, God gave the Israelites instructions that would restrict what they could do as time went on. Among the 600 plus laws God gave them through Moses, he gave these instructions restricting slavery. If slaves should escape from their masters and take refuge with you, you must not hand them over to their masters. Let them live among you in any town they choose, and do not oppress them. From Deuteronomy 23. If someone is caught kidnapping a fellow Israelite and treating or selling them as a slave, the kidnapper must die. From Deuteronomy 24. And if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. So God took into account the kind of world the Israelites lived in at that time and the economic realities of the time. But he restricted them from engaging in the harsh brutality found in surrounding nations. That was the Old Testament, and the laws of Moses that God gave to Israel were for that nation alone, not for us today. We are not required to keep a kosher diet, to dress and groom as God required the ancient Jews to, or to offer up the animal sacrifices specified in that set of laws. The moral standards God gave them and the standards of decent behavior still enlighten us today, but God's old covenant with the Jews has passed away, and Jesus instituted a new covenant with his followers. The Apostle Paul wrote that, I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. We are called on to fulfill the law of Christ. Accordingly, the New Testament gives guidelines for dealing with slavery, guidelines for Christians in Bible times who lived in the Roman Empire. Even though slavery does not exist in our modern Western society, the principles expressed in those guidelines can still help us today in relationships between employers and employees. If we find ourselves working at a job we hate but can't find other employment, we might view ourselves as wage slaves, enslaved by an unfair economic system. But still, we should keep the attitude Paul advised Christians to display under Roman slavery. He said, all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. We can do that if we think of ourselves as working for God, not just for our employer. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. This advice can help us today if we find ourselves stuck in a job with a harsh or unfair employer. Peter writes, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. But when enemies of the faith tried to take away the Apostle Paul's freedom, Paul took full advantage of the Roman legal system and his rights as a citizen, and he advised those who were already in slavery when they turned to Christ to take advantage of opportunities to become free. He wrote, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. Of course, there were others back in the first century who were in better economic circumstances when they became Christians, and they likely owned slaves, as that was how Roman society was set up. The apostles' letters reminded them that slavery was merely a human institution, but that God viewed slaves and masters as equals. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Paul wrote that to the Ephesians. And to the Colossians he wrote, masters, provide your slaves with what is fair and right, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. The New Testament writers were not just talking about slavery theoretically or intellectually. They knew personally both their fellow believers who were slaves and their fellow believers who owned slaves. That's especially clear in Philemon, the shortest book in the New Testament. It's actually a letter from the Apostle Paul to a rich slave owner named Philemon about a runaway slave named Onesimus. In fact, Onesimus belonged to Philemon under Roman law. He was one of Philemon's slaves who had run away, far away, 1,000 miles away. When the Apostle Paul wrote his letter to Philemon, Onesimus was with Paul in Rome. But he was a wanted man. Onesimus was a fugitive under Roman law. Unlike the compassionate Jewish law that we looked at a moment ago, Roman law required that a runaway slave be handed back to his master, and it required that he be punished severely as a warning to other slaves not to run away. Roman slaves who were captured as runaways were often branded on their foreheads with a hot iron, like cowboys out west used to brand cattle. The brand would put the letters F-U-G on their forehead, which stood for fugitive in Latin. But God had let Paul lead the runaway slave Onesimus to Christ. And Philemon, who owned Onesimus under Roman law, was also a Christian. So Paul does not turn Onesimus over to the Roman authorities to be chained up, branded in his forehead, and sent back to his master. Instead, Paul writes a letter to his master, his letter to Philemon, and he asks the runaway slave Onesimus to deliver it. In the letter, Paul asks Philemon to view Onesimus now as a brother, not a slave, and to treat the runaway as he would treat the Apostle Paul himself. Paul writes, "I am sending him back. You therefore receive him, that is my own heart, whom I wished to keep with me, that on your behalf he might minister to me in my chains for the gospel. But without your consent I wanted to do nothing, that your good deed might not be by compulsion, as it were, but voluntary. For perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, and how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. If then you count me as a partner, receive him as you would me." It's clear that Paul viewed this runaway slave as a brother, a fellow believer, an equal, and Paul wanted the slave's legal owner to have that view as well. Slavery is a foreign concept to us today, an offensive concept, as it should be. But that was the world Christians were faced with at the time Paul wrote this letter. It was a pagan world, filled with injustice and brutality. Christians could not overthrow the whole social order, but they did take steps whenever they could to improve the conditions of those who lived as slaves. And Christian abolitionists were the ones who took the lead in abolishing slavery and putting an end to it in the realms of Christendom. We today can continue to help liberate people who don't even realize that they are slaves to sin and slaves to the lies of the devil. Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin." Peter wrote concerning false teachers that they promise them freedom while they themselves are slaves to depravity. For a man is a slave to whatever has mastered him. Christ is the only one who can set them free, but we can have a share in that by introducing them to Christ when we share the gospel message with them. Hebrews says, "Now since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death." Our words introducing them to the power of the gospel can help set them free. Let us all speak up then when we have opportunity to defend the Bible and what it says about slavery, and to defend the Bible against all attacks from those who deny that it's the Word of God. And let's share the liberating gospel message with all who will listen. In addition to these live streamed services, Bible Nook provides Bibles and books that you can download for free in digital form at BibleNook.com. Our videos of the worship services and individual messages are available for streaming at youtube.com/BibleNook and also at facebook.com/BibleNookMinistry. These live streamed services are aimed at providing traditional worship services for believers who otherwise would not have them because they're confined to the home or because they don't have a nearby church that sings traditional hymns and preaches Bible messages. And these services are also aimed at reaching the world with messages proclaiming and upholding the gospel of Christ. We pay Facebook to boost our messages, and we pay Google to advertise our YouTube messages, with the result that the thought-provoking thumbnails have reached millions of people. And Facebook and YouTube report hundreds of thousands of views by people who watch and listen. For example, more than 80,000 views were reported for our message on the signs leading up to Christ's return, and about 85,000 views for our message, "Don't count on a second chance if you're left behind." Our other messages are reaching additional thousands each week. No one takes any salary from Bible Nook. All the gifts we receive go directly to spreading the gospel message. If the Lord moves your heart to spend some of your resources on this gospel outreach, you can do so by visiting BibleNook.com and clicking the donate button on the home page, or by sending a check to Bible Nook, 214 Onset Avenue, Suite 1464, Onset, Massachusetts, 02558.
Pastor David Reed has authored numerous books, served as a contributing editor of Dr. Walter Martin's Christian Research Journal, taught at Spurgeon's in London, and pastored Emmanuel Baptist Church in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He now provides these worship services for individuals at home, and free to use by small groups and churches.